So we are in John 20, and the passages are the verses that we're supposed to be covering are verses 19 through 20, which is the post-resurrection appearance mainly to to Thomas, but also to the other disciples. But here's the thing: I'm going to go over the whole chapter 20 because I think it's a little weird to like leave out. You go from crucifixion, and then you skip over like the whole empty tomb thing, and then you just go to where Jesus is appearing to the disciples. There's more to the story than that, right? And so he is we if you skip that part, you miss this discovery of the empty tomb and also Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene. So the second thing that we miss if we skip over like a big section like that is that there's some important details there, but also it's like you just kind of go one big event, or you go from a big event, skip over a couple of big events, and then go to this other big event. But there's some details in there, and there's also some confusion and some waiting that we were skipping over in the passage. And so I think when you skip over chunks of the story like that, you are missing even in the times when it seems like nothing's going on. That's part of the story, right? As part of the story, we don't go from one major event to another. There's a pause in between. And if we don't think that that's important, then we're missing part of the message. Because a lot of life is the in between places, right? So um if we miss that, we're missing kind of the flow and the rhythm that God's giving to us in the story. Like this is, they talked about history is God's story. It's his story. And when we miss those moments, we're not going to recognize that pattern in our own life, right? So if we miss the pauses and the little hints that are dropped in this story, then probably going to miss that in ours too. We're not going to recognize it because we're missing it. So we talked a little bit about liturgy and our lack of it in the Baptist church, and I have always been in low church my whole life, so I've never really been in a church that has a lot of liturgy. I went to a Methodist church where they're a little bit more liturgical. They have a liturgical calendar, sort of. They do responsive readings, but I generally no. So I'm not really hung up on it, but I can recognize that I kind of miss that part of, or I don't have that experience of having this structured part of worship, right? And so I was actually talking to my girls about this because they've been in at Second Baptist mainly for most of their life, and the extent of our liturgy here is reading the Nicene Creed when we take communion. And that's actually kind of unusual for Baptists. Honestly, I was talking to another Baptist pastor, and he's like, "Oh, that's really cool, because Baptists don't have a liturgy. We just like do whatever we want to do when we want to do it, right? We don't really follow a pattern." So, I was actually talking to somebody else about this, and it's like so different from other people's experience in church that they don't get that we don't have that. They're like, all churches have liturgy. I'm like, no, they don't. Google it, Baptists and Quakers. We don't have liturgy. So, um, we I was actually explaining to my girls this week what liturgy is, and it's, this is the definition of a rite or body rites prescribed for public worship, like baptism, ideas, phrases, observances that we observe at certain times corporately. So we're all going through this together, right? And in the Catholic Church, it's about, like Christmas, we think of his birth, but actually, it's not only about his birth, but it's also looking forward to the second coming, right? And so they'll have, more high church, they'll have set sermons that they preach. They have set prayers that they observe. They have like songs that they'll sing at certain times. They'll have like Lent is observing, Jesus's 40 days in the wilderness. It's set times of reflection going into so we can observe and really understand and appreciate, his life. And so we do have, I mean, we do have a little bit of that, right? We have been doing Stations of the Cross to have that reflection. That's not normal for Baptists. The other thing that we have, we can have our personal liturgy too. So I think that is something to remember. When you have moments in your life that you need to mark, right? Things that you want to remember. We can have our own those moments, like those Ebenezer's. I'm going to remember this. This is what God's done for me. This is what God tells us to do, is we're to remember what God's done for him or for us. And we kind of have that in I'm sure people in the choir can tell the story, but we have that in this church, this campus. Um, there's a song, there's one Sunday they always sing, "These are the days of Elijah." And that's a memory of, like, there was this big church upset, going from Forest Cove to when they came into second. And that's something that this church, at least under Mark Terry, does every year on that particular Sunday. And it's a memory of that time, of what the church has come through as a church. So, we can have these liturgies as a whole. We can have them, in communities. That's what our holidays really are, right? Like, we remember these things. We can do it personally, but I think it's important to remember those things and remembering what came before. Those times that came before the victory, because there's always going to be a pause in the struggle before that victory. And if you don't recognize what that looks like and what that feels like and other things, you're not going to remember it in.
You're talking about it, like communion, you do it and remember what Jesus Christ has done for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, churches do that, but that we read the Nicene Creed here when we take communion. Yeah, I mean, so the only thing that Jesus told us we have to do, right, is believers' baptism and taking communion, remembering what he did for us, right? But what I'm saying is, like, communion here at Second, what's unusual for Baptists, because most Baptists don't do this, we read the Nicene Creed. Well, and that's the only time we do responsive reading, I think. We do that, right? So I'm just saying, these things where we do things corporately together to remember, like this corporate remembrance, is important. So Jesus said to do this, always remember this. This is what I did for you, right? But we have these other things, these other patterns of remembering his life. And you can get this like this rhythm, like you can feel it. Okay, this is okay, it feels like I'm going through a struggle right now, right? But hey, this is what it seems uncertain. I don't know what's coming. But then just around the corner, the answer comes, right? And this is what you see here in this passage. So the other part of, like, we're actually in a period of time right now. This is between, let me see if I have my next slide. It's between the Resurrection Sunday and Pentecost. It's actually, I'm not going to get into this because this is a whole thing, but that is the Resurrection Sunday was first fruits, right? In the Levitical feast. And there was 50 days, and there would be another observance, which was Shavuot, which is like it's after 7 weeks. So 7 weeks is 7 days, right? And it's a completion. They would do the first fruits is which was Resurrection Sunday when Jesus came, right? First fruits is they would do an offering of the barley harvest, right? And then the Shavuot was that they do an offering of the wheat harvest, but for them it was an expression of God's faithfulness, but it also was a remembrance of the time when God, between the first giving of the law and the second, because this is a remembrance. It's called the counting of the Omer. So this is this period of time between the Resurrection Sunday and Pentecost, which is next week. Pentecost is when the whole baptism of the Holy Spirit came, right? But there is this it's kind of this crazy time when, like, Jesus is like, he's appearing to people, he's coming, it's like, what's coming, what's happening next, right? And he's saying, hey, you gotta wait a little bit. And he sends at day 40, which was just like, if we were observing that would have been on Thursday. But I'm not gonna get into all this, but we're in a season now where historically, both in Judaism and Christianity, this has been remembered. This has been remembered, like, remember God's faithfulness, remember what he's done. So I want to do kind of like a little recap of where we go. Sometimes we read it and we just kind of read it. So just like imagine this is what's going on. So we're going into John 20, right? Mary's coming to the tomb. This is what's happened. The crucifixion has just happened. So they've had this week where starting the week, just in the period of 7 days, they've gone, they've entered Jerusalem and it's the triumphal entry and they're coming in and the disciples are singing, right? And they're thinking, this is going to be it. This is finally going to be vindication. The Jews are accepting Jesus. He's the Messiah. He's the one that, they're going into this Passover, this week of Passover, this celebration. Moses has delivered the Israelites from Egypt. This is what they're remembering. And I'm sure as they're going in, at least one of them, if not multiple, had to be thinking, this is it. This is the Messiah. He is going to deliver us from the Romans. We have been under a repression. This is an exploitive society. And this is finally going to happen. We are finally going to be free of this oppression. This is going to happen. This is what they thought. And then what happens? They go in, Jesus is betrayed. These powers that have been put in place by the Romans, the sold out, the Jewish leaders, both, Romans and Jews, sell him out. He's crucified. He's dead. He's laid in the tomb. They've seen it. His body is dead, right? He's dead. It's over. And this is what they're thinking. And then they're sitting there and they're in this feast of unleavened bread where they're supposed to remember that first day of the feast of unleavened bread. I think they fast that first day, but they're supposed to be remembering to be ready, right? God's taking them, remembering this time when God delivered them from Egypt. And just imagine, this is a time of celebration where they all come together. So they have all these people around them that are celebrating, that are seeing family again because they're all coming in, and Jesus is dead. Just imagine what it's like. You're in the middle of this, everybody's celebrating. There's probably people sitting around as they're in these meetings that are mocking Jesus, right? Having conversations about what just happened. Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus is crucified, and they're probably mocking the disciples, talking about him, like, oh yeah, they thought this, and this is how it came out. This is their state of mind. So, this is what had just happened, right? Okay. This verse 1. Let me move this down here. Okay. A little bit. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. I've read this whole thing. It can be rolled, it can be moved. There's this whole article about, it was probably square. So you wouldn't be rolling it, but the word could be moved too. But we picture it as around stone rolled. Okay.
But the whole idea that it was so large, it couldn't be.
Yeah, it could not be. Yeah, that's right. That's the whole point. So she ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and we know this is John. It's like, she said, they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So I want to go back to this, the whole thing about the purpose of the visit to the tomb after 3 days. It was to determine the condition of the corpse. So this is normal. It wasn't like she was going expecting anything. This is just what they did. This was normal. This is actually from, the quote is from some Jewish midrash about instructions. One should go to the cemetery to check the dead within 3 days and not fear that such smacks of pagan practices. There was actually one buried man who was visited after 3 days and lived for 25 more years and had sons and died afterwards. So this is just what they did. It wasn't that they were expecting anything. They just went on the third day.
This was the tradition that they expected to get in there, knowing that this immovable.
Well, that's the thing. She would have had to, yeah, that's a good question. I think what she was expecting there to be soldiers there, because there were supposed to be soldiers that were posted at the tomb. So maybe she was going to be thinking, okay, I'm going to go and I'm just going to say, hey, I need to, do this because this was a common practice.
Yeah.
And they would have had to move it. I mean, they would have been standing there, but she goes, right?
And what thought that add to that was that remember the seventh day was coming up. And,
Oh, they had passed.
no, I'm saying, the reason why they hurried to bury
Yeah,
Jesus
yeah.
was that the seventh was coming up, they could not leave his body over the seventh day. So therefore, they rushed to bury him. So
Yeah,
that maybe in traditional times, if the individual died, they would just kind of let his body lie for those 3 or 4 days.
could have
But
been.
because of it was, and the fact that, you know, uh, they were rushing to get rid of him, they decided to bury him, to lay his body out over everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joseph was part of the, they put every pound their rights. And they found that those went out for food and then parts of the state. So, looking at all parts, he was declared dead by the Romans, but they couldn't take him off the cross before he was dead. And
Mhm.
so that was an indication. What he went through is very difficult. But the part of it is Lazarus, Jesus waited 4 days of life. That's what the 3 days was.
Yeah.
That was the normal people who died, not all crucifixion, the other part. That was so that was a pretty normal part.
Yeah, so there's
Because
confirmation that he was dead.
normal
Yeah.
people had been buried alive.
Yeah.
They part back around there, stretching on the cross.
Yeah.
That's a long story there.
Yeah, so Lazarus, it was confirmation he was actually dead. Everybody knew he was actually dead. So, okay.
Also, it was God too, because the earth, God was dead.
They thought the disciples, oh, still his body. And yeah, yeah. So, but she went, she was just like, I'm gonna, I think about it as, the disciples were up, in an upper room, sitting there mourning. Mary was just going and doing what needed to be done. We knew she was very upset, but she still did what needed to be done. So Peter and the other disciples started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. This is John. Like I mentioned, like a little bit later in the message, Jesus called him and his brothers sons of thunder. Here he's still, I mean, you can tell, like by the time he writes the Gospel of John, he's toned down a little bit, but he still has a little bit of, oomph in him because he's like, I outran Peter. So he just kind of, yeah, I got there first.
My question is, why did the other guy didn't go?
That's true. Well, she found them.
She only found the two.
Found the two wherever they were. Yeah, they found the two.
They didn't believe it. They want to see it. The other guy said, "No, yeah, sure."
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about
But
that.
John was
They were doubters. They were all doubters.
Yeah, that's true. We'll give John that. He was younger than Peter, and that's why. Yeah. Okay. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived. Okay, so he runs there. He doesn't go in. He's probably, think about it, he's probably a little freaked out. Like, what? What's going on? Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside because, Peter, he's always like going for it, getting into stuff like that he maybe shouldn't. So he just goes in. John's a little bit more, maybe I should pause before I go into this tomb with the body missing. So Peter arrives and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there. So we have two witnesses, right? While the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings, then the disciples who had reached the tomb first also went in. So John goes in and he saw it and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. So, as I said, like Jesus' followers had been through this emotional upheaval. I mean, just trying to imagine what this was like, and they weren't experiencing, they weren't expecting anything other than what normally happens when someone dies and is buried. They expect the person to stay dead. This is what they were expecting. And even though they had seen that other people, brought back to life in Jesus' ministry, and they had seen Lazarus brought back from the dead after, those 4 days, they weren't expecting anything else. They weren't expecting anything else. But they began to see signs that things might not be as they seem. So the stone had been moved, the tomb was empty, no body was found, and but the wrappings were there and the cloth. So they didn't take the body, right? Like if somebody had taken the body, they would have taken the wrappings with them, right? They would have taken the wrappings, wouldn't like unwrapped the body and carried them out. But they're like, okay, what is going on there? And so that it's then that John saw and believed, and the dots began to be connected, right? And they realized that how they had always interpreted the scriptures might actually not be what they meant. So they had read the scriptures, they knew them, they saw and they interpreted them a particular way, and that kind of blocked them to what the truth was about them because they thought it was going to be a certain way. And so it took them some time to get off that wrong thinking and to realize what had actually happened, right? So this next part, I just, again, imagine this. This is just kind of weird to me. So Peter and John come out and they look, they see all this, right? They run all out there, they see it, and it's like they went, interesting. Literally, what was the deal with that? It's like, we're gonna have to ask them this when we get to heaven. What were you thinking? What were you thinking? Like, did you not think, okay, maybe we should like check this out? I mean, literally, what were you thinking? She's like, oh wow, cool. We're just gonna go back home. So they saw, and according to John, they understood, right? And they go home. But Mary is still there. She doesn't go home. She's still there. Okay. Verse 11. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stood and looked in. So she hasn't even made it this far. She just sees or she must have, because she saw that the body wasn't there. But anyway, she looks in again. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. Dear woman, why are you crying? The angels asked her. Because they have taken away my Lord, she replied, and I don't know where they have put him. So in other accounts, she's thinking they're the gardener. This is like I don't think they had wings. Like, I have this depiction here. It's like they have, these wings on the angels. I don't think the angels had wings. I think they were just two beings sitting there, look like men, right? And she saw them. And so I'm thinking, they were probably there when John and Peter came too, right? But they didn't see. Mary had eyes to see. She didn't understand, but she was seeking, right? And so she hadn't understood. She hadn't made the connection that according to John, Peter and John understood. They made the connection then when they went to the tomb. They understood that Jesus had risen from the dead. She had not made that connection yet, but she stayed and she continued to seek him. And so she saw something that the disciples did not see. She sees these two angels. And then we're going to see, like, who's the first person to see the resurrected Lord? It was Mary. It was Mary Magdalene. So, to me, as I was writing this, I was thinking, it doesn't matter how much you know and understand if you don't stay the course. She didn't understand it. She didn't get it at that point, but she still stayed. Okay. Okay, so she turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. Dear woman, why are you crying? Jesus asked her. Who are you looking for? She thought he was a gardener. Sir, she said, if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him. Mary, Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, Rabboni, which is Hebrew for teacher. Don't cling to me, Jesus said, for I haven't yet ascended to the Father, but go find my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, I have seen the Lord. and then she gave him his message. So we know from other accounts, other gospel accounts, they didn't believe her. Did not believe her. So I don't know. It's just common. This is one of the evidences for the resurrection that Jesus first appeared to the woman, because that was like an unbelievable account. I mean, you couldn't take a woman could not testify in court. No, a woman's testimony would not be believed. So if someone was making up the story, they would not make up that it was a woman that found found this verse. Okay, so this is verse 19. This is starting our actual passage that is assigned. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. They were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again, he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." And so this is in the later guide, it points out that this sending, it's this continual sending. Like, this isn't just a one-time thing. This is ongoing. Can't remember what the verb tense would be, but anyways, this ongoing command. Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." So this is a fresco called the Anastasis fresco. It's in the Torah Monastery in Istanbul, Turkey. But this is actually a fresco of the herring of hell, like when Jesus went to the grave and released the captives. This is what it's but they saw and they believed, and Jesus breathed on them, and they received the Holy Spirit. So they had that same Holy Spirit, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. And he also gives them the authority to forgive sins. So remember, this is what the Pharisees got upset about with Jesus, because Jesus, they thought he was being very presumptuous and was blaspheming when he said to a man, "Your sins are forgiven," right? It's because only God can forgive sins. So this is the moment. This moment right here is when man's authority given to him at creation, right? When Adam sinned, he was given authority and dominion over the earth, and he lost that with the fall. But at this moment, Jesus is restoring that authority, and through his sacrifice, defeated the power of sin in the grave, and as a man, and gave back man that authority that had been lost. So this is verse 24. So one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, "We've seen the Lord." And he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hands into the wounds in his side." This is what is this? This is in let's see, let me tell you where it's at. This is in I can't tell where this is. I don't remember. Oh, the Hosea Lucas Monastery. That's another fresco. But so Thomas is often known as Doubting Thomas because of this. Because he says, "I'm not going to believe until I see it," right? But the thing is, the other disciples didn't really either. So no. So it isn't as if Thomas was really all that different. He really wasn't, right? And so when Jesus was told that, I mean, looking back at that, the little we know about like Thomas and his interaction as Jesus's disciple, when Jesus was told that Lazarus was dead, and then he starts taking off to Bethany, right? And all the other disciples were freaking out, saying, "Why are you going back? He's dead. And don't you know these people want to kill you?" It's like, why are you going back there? There's no point now. What are you doing? And Thomas is the one who said, "Okay, let's just go down with Jesus. Let's just go. We're going to go." And so we get a little bit of a picture of the personality of the disciples in the gospel. So Peter, it seems to me, he was flighty. He's always letting his mouth go before, his head, jumping out of perfectly good boats, cutting off ears. He's just flighty. He's just flighty. And, John, Jesus called him and his brother the son's offender, and you can see a little bit of that, it just in this account. I mean, I think even as you read this one chapter, you can kind of see. I mean, when John wrote this was like 70 years later, but you can still see that emotion. Like, I beat Peter. I did this, I got there first. You can just see a little bit of that emotion there too, that it comes back up. So I think, he had more of a stormy temperament, and they changed. Peter did become like he stood firm. When Jesus called him the rock, that is not how he was at the time. He was not that before the cross. He was not. He was flighty. But he at the end of his life, he's the one who had denied Jesus, who ran off and hid, but at the end of his life, he was martyred. He was crucified upside down because he didn't even want to be crucified upright as Jesus had been done. So he was crucified upside down. So he stood in the faith. Did become the rock, but he wasn't when Jesus said that. He was not at all. And they probably thought maybe Jesus is just being funny, being sarcastic because it's not how he was. But when I read the account, Thomas comes across me as steady. He's determined. He was ready to go with Jesus to the end. He had witnessed all of these amazing miracles. Just imagine what this is like walking around with Jesus for 3 years. Just imagine this. And they had, he'd been around probably some kind of odd people. They had been in all these situations where there's all these, treacherous religious people and politicians and, just trying to like trip Jesus up and, cause problems. And, they had just been through this very traumatic week, really all these highs and lows, these ups and downs. And I kind of think maybe he wasn't used to that range of emotion. And so he said, I won't believe until I see it. I'm not going to believe until I see. He probably saw people getting all like, ooh, freaked out. And he's just like, I won't believe it until I see it. So what's interesting about this next part, and I never thought about this until I was writing this happened when the disciples were all together, right? So Thomas had just said, I'm not going to believe until I see it. So if Jesus had come to him by himself, I wonder what would he have told the other disciples? Would he have told them? Because steady, if someone's really steady and determined, that's their nature, sometimes they can be kind of stubborn too. So there may have been this temptation there to not admit it, and just I don't know, but this didn't happen. So that's not what happened. So verse 26, 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. My Lord and my God, Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, you believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. And Jesus is still risen, right? He's still living. And yes, he still does appear to people. So we still hear stories about this. So, and we have a tendency to kind of lionize people like this. They're the ones that will get asked to go speak on like Sid Roth and all this other stuff, and everybody wants to hear their stories. But we chase after the Jesus encounter stories, but Jesus says here that those who have not seen but believe are more blessed. That's the story, right? That's the bigger story. And so the leader's guide points out that Jesus met Thomas where he was. He knew what he needed. But I think that each of us should probably think about whose example are we following? Are we like Thomas, who has to be so certain of everything that there's no room for doubt before he believes? Or are we like Mary, who stayed and saw it even though she didn't understand? So I'm going to read the last part of John 20. This is about the purpose of the book. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. So I think that, this is, when John was writing this is, again, we've talked about this was at the end of the first century. There was a lot of Gnostics that were coming and saying, you know, that it was all, the body was evil, that it was all about knowledge, that you had to do, that it was, you know, your own light, that you had to kind of do works, right? If you had right knowledge, that you would gain salvation. That was a Gnostic belief. But John is saying it's by the power of his name. And I don't think that it's an accident that he begins with Mary, who, even though they understood and they left, they had the knowledge and they left. He didn't understand, but she was the one who saw Jesus. And so it's like she didn't know, she didn't ever understand, but she was the one who got to see him first because she still sought him. She was seeking him, not, you know, she didn't have to understand everything first. So anyway, that's my my lesson. There. Do you guys have any comments? We have 10 minutes.
I like the print.
Yeah.
They are. That was a good story. Good,
Let me stop
I
recording.
guess